This tutorial is sponsored by the 3D Coloring Book, a project specifically designed to help empower artists who are struggling with texturing in Substance Painter and to help show you that anyone can create beautiful pieces of art with just a little bit of practice and guidance. To instantly gain access to hundreds of pre-made professional level models and hours of high quality tutorials, click the link in the description and begin your journey today.
Hey everyone! In this video, I'd like to show you guys the workflow I've learned when creating hand-painted assets. I will be going through my process for the Champion's Pride sword. Credit goes to Ben Rosado, who is the original concept artist for making this wonderful piece. I will be using programs such as Maya, 3D Coat, Photoshop, and Marmoset Toolbag. Any other similar programs work as well. You just have to know the program's tools that are similar to what I show you, like if you're using Blender as opposed to Maya, or GIMP as opposed to Photoshop. Throughout this video, I'll also explain some important techniques and some of the things I've learned at my time at Noman School of Visual Effects. And with that, let's get right to it. The first most important thing to do is building a reference library. Even though we'll be doing a one-to-one likeness based on a stylized concept, there are things that a 2D image cannot translate into 3D. No matter how good the concept is. Not only will you understand how certain materials look like, you'll also have a better understanding on some important things that you'll need, like how light scatters on an object or material. And since we'll be hand painting everything and not relying on any maps, lights, or bakes, everything will have to be faked. This will also help on the anatomy of characters, or in this case, a weapon. You can even reuse these references for other projects, which helps a lot in the research part. Find reference to different materials, weapons, realistic and stylized, or existing assets that are similar to the concept. I'll be going back to look at the reference to help push my project. I recommend using PureRef, as it has an overlay mode that will constantly open as the top layer no matter where you click. You can use it as a reference dump and organize it as you like. Remember that even though this is a stylized piece, it's important to take reference from real life, because it still imitates from real-life sources. Just because it's a stylized piece doesn't mean you should only use stylized references. So let's start with the modeling process in Maya. I'm not going into the basics of modeling. I'm only going to talk about the techniques I use that pertain to my modeling workflow for assets or characters. I'm going to be importing an image plane with Ben Rosado's concept. I prefer image planes rather than mesh planes with textures, because a lot of the modeling will be done in wireframe mode, and textures tend to disappear during that process, unlike an image plane. With my image plane imported, I'm going to scale it up a bit. The image I use is a little small, and I want a lot of room for modeling. I'm moving the image plane to wherever I'd like so that I can start off my modeling process. I'm going to be creating a plane, rotating it on the x-axis. I want to make sure that it is parallel to my image plane. You want to get rid of the extra subdivisions so you'll have a singular face. I'm making sure that I have a flat surface that I can select and make it live. This way, I can quad draw on top of it and create a nice silhouette of my blade. I highly recommend moving around the image plane as well. As you can see, the concept is not centered perfectly, and not fixing that one small change has caused me a lot of problems before. It's also always nice to name everything in your outliner. It's just better to have this organized, and having clean naming conventions is always a good thing to continuously practice. As I said earlier, I'm going to be staying in wireframe mode while I'm in my front axis. This way, I can see where I'm drawing without the reference disappearing. I'm starting with the blade because I feel like it is the most important piece. A sword is nothing without the blade, and the measurements will dictate how the rest of my weapon will look like. With my live surface enabled, I'm taking the quad draw tool and creating vertices at important areas of the blade. Especially with anything stylized, low poly models need to have carefully placed areas where the silhouette will form. I'm placing them on edges to draw out the silhouette, and also whenever there's a change of plane where there's a highlight in the edge. A lot of hand-painted models have very defined highlighted edges, so it's important to keep that in mind. You also want the topology to be clean too and not dense. If you decide to make your model more dense with a higher polygon count, then that works too. But usually with models like this and hand painting techniques, we're staying on the lower end of topology. It all depends on the game that's running it and the engine too. You don't want a dense model while everything else is low. I'm carefully creating landmarks that I will be going over later. Now I'm going to be speeding things up so you won't have to watch me repeat the same thing over and over. I'm just doing the same thing on the other side of the blade. Usually for game res models, I would only model one side and mirror the other side so that they would have the same topology. But this concept is unique in that it has lighting in one direction, so we'll be painting it with intended lighting. Plus, it's always good to have some more modeling practice, and certain topology for this weapon is unique for either side, especially with the blade. You might notice that I'm adding subdivisions wherever there are dents. Now normally, you would paint in those dents, especially for those minor crevices. But I'm taking some creative interpretation and adding them in. It makes the silhouette more interesting and readable. Now, I'm just making sure that topology is in place. I have no existing n-gons, and that everything is placed in the right areas. You want to make sure that you have a developed non-destructive workflow for your modeling process. Now that you're finished with drawing out your blade, switch back to your perspective camera. Everything is laid out nice and flat. Now what I'm doing is selecting all the interfaces of the blade, mainly whenever there is a change of angle. After selecting the faces, I'm moving them forward so that I can start the transition from 2D to 3D. This is a very crucial part of the model. The blade cannot be too thick or too thin. And this is where looking at reference helps out. I like to look around, look for any assets I see, and I get to judge for myself. Hey, what do other companies like Blizzard or Riot do for their weapons? Since they're both popular for creating hand-painted style weapons. And I'm also looking at real-life weapons for reference too. I'm trying to decide, is this blade too thick or is it too thin? And that is the issue. It's a 2D concept and I don't have enough information from the concept by itself. So, it's up to me to interpret how thick or thin the blade is. Because if the proportions are wrong or look weird, then the sword will not sell. This also calls for characters too, because proportions are key. If I make the blade too thick, then it'll read as a Zambado type of sword or a Buster sword. If it's too thin, then it's more of a saber at this point. And I don't want to go for that. I kind of want to go for something like a claymore or a greatsword. Something that a real champion would use, like a paladin, a hero main story character, or a stalwart knight. At this point, I'm going to be taking care of the dents and fixing the topology a little bit. Right now, I'm grabbing the verts and or edges and moving them around so that I can have some correct topology. In addition to the correct amount of seams that conform to the edges where I'd like them to be. Now I'm going to be using the multi-cut tool and creating some segments for my dents. I'll also be deleting some edges or moving them around so my dents can be modeled in perfectly. It's important to use transform constraints at this stage. Since I moved those faces forward, any of the new vertices or edges that I created must conform to the angle of the plane that was just formed. If I move any vertice without using the transform constraint, then it would break the flat plane and the model would be ruined for that area. Now I said earlier that this isn't really necessary since most low poly models that you'll be painting on won't have any of these semi-complex areas that need to be modeled. But in this case, the concept has very defined dents, and not modeling them in would give off a faked look in that 3D painting. Even though everything is faked, if there is a chance to making things look like they belong, then do whatever you need to achieve that goal. So I'm just deleting some edges right now and fixing the topology. I'm finding quick ways of identifying n-gons so that there are none in my scene. Remember that n-gons are bad and quads and tries are good. Sometimes you'll have to change a quad into multiple tries so that there's no placement for an n-gon. Right now, I'm moving vertices so that they form fit better with the blade and the dent. And at this point, I'm actually going to be using it for the other dents. Now the other dents have a similar workflow, so I'm going to breeze past through it, but it'll be the same thing. Make sure that there is conformity when it comes to the silhouette of the dent, draw out necessary vertices and edges so that there is correct topology on the indents, and make sure that you're using transform constraints to move around vertices so that they don't break the flat angles that they were created earlier. I cannot stress this enough on how important this is, and there's a reason I have been repeating this last step. Now it's looking like it's at a good spot. All the dents are modeled, and we can go to the next step. At this point, I'll be duplicating mesh, inversing it at the appropriate axis, freezing transformations, deleting history, and inversing face normals if you have to, just so you can mirror it to the other side. Now I'm only showing these steps for demonstrative purposes, or in this case, if anyone needs a refresher on how to do it. I was able to make a script so that it does this all for me in a single button, so you guys won't have to hear or watch me make all those repeated steps again, because you'll be doing that throughout the modeling process. So I'm combining them, merging vertices, checking to see if any vertices aren't connected. I'll then be deleting only the faces that are in the dents. With all the indents faces deleted, I'm going to be filling in or bridging the empty gaps. You don't want any empty faces in your scene right now, and it's really important for the next step. It helps push the form and the look of the blade. You want to make sure that you're selecting the right edges and filling in the space. You don't want to end up selecting any extra edges and creating a penetrating face out of nowhere. So after you fill in all the gaps, you want to grab the vertices and use Connect Components so that they create an edge that'll solidify the indent. I recommend this over using the multi-cut tool, because if you're at a weird angle, it could cut right through any faces that obstruct the view based on the viewport. We'll then switch to the multi-cut tool so that we can connect the centered vertices. This way the model will be completely in half, using shift so that your vertices will be placed halfway through the edge and then connect to the following vertice. Now that we have a model that can be perfectly mirrored, we can delete the back half of the blade so that we can mirror it to the other side. Just checking to see if everything's clean. Don't want any extra faces pointing out or any faces that we accidentally deleted. Yeah, everything seems good. Then we'll leave selecting faces and switch back to object mode. Just checking one more time. So switch back to the front camera, and at this point we want to unwrap the model. And we're unwrapping this model with the half deleted because the other side of the model will be sharing the same UV shell as the one in the front. So when we're mirroring the model, we'll also be mirroring the UVs. I chose to use the camera-based unwrap model so that I can have a flat UV shell. And like I'm showing you, if I were to unwrap it by normal means, just unfolding the UV shell, I'm going to get some crazy shell that I'll have to fix anyways. A while ago, I had the chance to talk to Mark Anderson, who works for Blizzard Entertainment. And he told me that when painting, you want your shells to act like a canvas, so everything has to lay flat. You don't want too many separate UV shells for one object, or else it'll just be harder to paint. If you see some of the diffuse maps for Riot or Blizzard stuff, they're beautifully painted and are masterpieces themselves. And also make sure that you set your UV shells accordingly, so it's not too stretched or squashed. And another important note is that when you do camera-based, a lot of the parts will be obstructed. The dents UVs will have to be moved so that you can be placed accordingly and painted well. So now that the shell is laid out, I'm going to mirror it to the other side using the script I made. It does everything in one button, so I don't have to repeat all those steps over and over. I would recommend going to scripting because it makes all these processes so much faster in Maya. And if you don't want to get into scripting, I would recommend going online and looking for some scripts that people have made and use that instead. And if you want to work in industry for either games or films, it doesn't hurt to come in with some extra knowledge in your tool belt. Right now, I'm just softening the edges, looking around to see if I made any mistakes. The UV shells are placed accordingly and everything is mirrored fine. I move the shells around a bit just to see that it's mirrored. And when you're finished, laying out your UV shells is important too, which I'll go over in a sec. So as I'm modeling, I just wanted to point out something where when I was making that blade, I was only doing camera-based UVings and unwrappings. Well, in this case, for the fuller, I wanted to show you for the workflow if you're just using any other piece that's not camera based. Like this is what you usually have to do, where you have to make sure that all the seams are together. There's no cut seams, and you just want to unfold it, and you see the UV shell is actually laid flat. And this is actually really good because if it turns well like this, if your topology is correct when it comes to laying out certain UVs, then this would be so much easier to paint on. And what I like to do is to grab the UVs and use the smoothing to kind of see if I can stretch a little bit or fix it. Because unfolding doesn't fix things automatically or doesn't do it the best automatically. You kind of have to tweak things. So I'm just trying to make sure that everything's well placed. As you can see in my check texture, that everything is laid out fine and all the squares are even. It's going to be so much easier to paint on. Oh, and don't forget to soften the edges too. That's important. So once you're done modeling, you have this nice finished model. Hopefully the topology is good, having some nice naming conventions, and the UV shells are laid out accordingly. Now, normally you want to fill out the entire space of the UV map. It's good for your shells to have the correct amount of textile density. And for weapons like this, I usually like to go with a 2-to-1 ratio of a 1024 by 512 map, which can be easily done, like in this example. But because this model has intended lighting and we're painting it in that matter, I can't mirror stack most of my shells. So we're in this weird halfway mark where I have either not enough space or too much space. Now I can increase the size of the other shells, but if I do that, then the quality of those shells versus, let's say, the blade, because it's at its maximum UV size, it will be very obvious, and we don't want that. Everything should be on a similar level. You don't want to have really high quality shells and have something as large as the blade be lower quality. It will definitely stand out. So we'll leave it as it is since it's more of a painting demonstration. I just wanted to show you guys how the UV shells should be laid out. Everything is flat and it can be easily be painted on. Now I want you to make sure that there's enough spacing between your UV shells. Because when we get into 3D coat, or if you're going to be using Substance Painter, and you have any overlapping shells, then that's not going to be good. Since I'm going to be painting in a 1K map, the resolution will shrink. And you'd be surprised at how much the spacing between the shells will shrink when transitioning into lower quality maps. So just to be safe, give it some room. Give it some space because it needs some air to breathe. Select the group and export it as FBX. In the next part, I'll show you my process during the hand painting part in 3D Coat. Alright, so we're going to delve into 3D Coat to start the hand painting process. Now this will be the longest part, but in my opinion, the most rewarding part. First thing to do is importing your model for per pixel painting. We're going to be importing the sword that we just modeled. Make sure that's in FBX. I'm going to be painting it in a 1K resolution. You can choose whatever resolution you'd like, but I prefer 1K. After importing the model in, you'll notice that it has a similar interface as other 3D programs. I'm not going to delve deep on how to use 3D Coat, but more on techniques that helped push my hand painting skills using techniques from 3D Coat. Now in the upper right part of the screen, I'm going to change the color spectrum into an image. With this, you can load any image at this point. So we're going to import Ben Rosado's concept. Now the great thing about this, and why I prefer it over the color spectrum, is that you can click anywhere on the image and it will pick out the color for you, which will help out a lot when deciding on colors or trying to take a 2D likeness into 3D like we are. Now in order to get the best experience with hand painting models, you want to press 2 in order to switch to diffuse color only mode. You can also hit W to enable or disable wireframes. That'll be important too when painting. And since you can see through some of the faces in the mesh, you want to toggle 6 for culling back faces. Now this model looks a little too dull for my liking, so let's start with the base. The base is important because it's the foundation of your piece. And we won't just simply add basic colors into it. We're going to be trying to add another technique. Now there is a fill tool option in 3D Coat. And in that fill tool option, there's a gradient mode. With the gradient mode, you can now select a color for point 1 and select a color for point 2. Now we can select the color points on the mesh. Now select the mesh and boom, there's gradiency. Now you can select other meshes that have the gold brass color and start filling them in. It will fill them based on the position of the color points. This is really important as a base because a lot of stylized work, whether it's characters, props, buildings, environments, they're all heavily layered with gradiency. Chris Stone, who works at Riot Games, was my props and weapons instructor, and he pointed out that all stylized works have gradiency, especially in the gaming industry. If you look at Overwatch, Tracer's leggings, which run from yellow to orange, are really apparent. Ori in the Blind Forest, they have beautiful gradient environments. And a lot of characters from World of Warcraft or League of Legends, they all fill that gradiency spectrum. It's a very important foundation that you should try your best not to lose. Or you can even continuously build it up. And with the base finished, we can finally get into painting. Alright, now we're at my favorite part of the process, the painting part. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be using a lot of layers, so you better get your naming conventions down and organize your stuff. And like I said too, this will take a long time. And I mean a very long time. But it is rewarding. 3D Coat shares a similar layers system as Photoshop. And I'm going to be referencing Photoshop a lot because it bridges and links with Photoshop that we'll be using later in the process. 3D Coat is a fairly simple program to use. So if you're using it, you'll get the hang of it easily. So now that we're painting, I just wanted to point out a few things. Now I'm not going to be showing the entire 12-hour process of painting and commentary I did for this project. It was difficult enough to cut it down to, the minor clips. But I will share some techniques you should know or that will benefit you in the painting process. I will say you need patience for this. The first time I did this weapon, it took me about 7 days to do. And I'm able to replicate it this time in 12 hours because I've learned some techniques along the way, and I had previously tackled these troubled areas before. Sometime last year, I contacted Jessica Murphy on Artstation. She does some wonderful stylized hand-painted characters and assets. I had a character I needed some advice on, and she was so wonderful to help a struggling student artist just like me. She introduced me to 3D Coat, and her foundations helped me till this day. She taught me that you should really only use the hard round alpha, which will be colored in red, and sometimes the softer alpha, colored in blue, to get those softer parts in there. But you're pretty much going to be sticking with the red alpha. Stick pretty much with the second brush though, which I'm going to highlight in green. It gives off the best hand painting feel. I like to start off with the highlights. Highlights are very important, especially in metals like gold or brass. They give off the form nicely and pop out the most in the model. Now highlights are also tricky. If you do them incorrectly, then it won't read off as metal or whatever material you're trying to mimic. With the gold, you want sharp transitions between values, but also want that nice soft layer in the soft transitions to make it feel like metal. There are balance in these things. I actually spoke with Ben Rosado on this. And a side note, I would highly recommend contacting the original concept artist if you're planning to model based off a concept art. They give advice from the source and can help you a lot when trying to nail that look. And if you don't get a response, it's better that you tried than you didn't. This was the advice that he gave me to help me push through my project. That last 10% that comes from experimenting. I'm not telling you to do exactly that, but experiment a bit. Research metals and what happens to them under stress or damage. See what colors happen to that and try experimenting in your texturing. For example, gold has crazy cool reflections and shadows that range from orange to yellow to almost brown. Now, I'll be coming back to that last 10% later on because it is crucial. Another important part about painting is the highlighted edge. I noted earlier that highlighted edges are the hallmark of stylized pieces. If it's not dents or trims, then it's edges. It's always one of those three. Plan your edges accordingly and watch them contour the piece because they help sell the 3D look. And highlighted edges help sell the piece even better. But don't overdo it. Carefully place them in areas where they make sense. Mess around with the highs to lows values like Ben said, and constantly refer to your references. And don't forget the foundation of gradiency. Throughout this section of the video, I've been mentioning Photoshop a lot in 3D Code. Photoshop is a very important tool if you choose to use it, and I'm going to show you why. If you hit Ctrl P in 3D Code, it will bridge the layers of 3D Code into Photoshop. And you notice it has the same layer system as 3D Code. That's because you are painting on the Photoshop layers and are linking them into 3D Code, which is really cool, and you can do a whole back and forth system, which you'll be doing a lot when painting the asset. Now at the bottom, you have a wireframe layer which sneakily hides itself in 3D Code, but only shows in Photoshop. I would duplicate the layer and bring it to the top layer. I wouldn't use the original layer, however, just duplicate it. It actually shows off the wireframe, which makes the process of painting so much easier. Because you're in Photoshop and not in 3D Code, you can't see the model you're painting on, and will have to rely on the wireframe to paint. If you have another monitor, you can look at the model while you paint, but it will only update on 3D Code if you save it into Photoshop. This is why it's important to paint in landmarks first to get a sense of where you're painting and how you're painting it. Another thing I like about Photoshop is the use of filters. Filters help out so much in the process. For example, I created a gem glue layer in my fuller. It didn't have enough green to my liking, and it would be a bit tedious just to erase and repaint it to the green I like. So in this case, I'll just link a layer to a filter and change the hue slider accordingly. Maybe bump the saturation a little bit. And there it changes. At this point, however, I would merge the layers. 3D Code cannot comprehend filters, so it wouldn't register. And naming conventions is important too. If you have a bunch of layers called hue and saturation, or levels, then 3D Code would just get confused. Photoshop can comprehend having 2 layers of the same name, but in 3D Code, the program will get confused and just reject the layers. It will be there, but just not show up in the viewport, so make sure all the layers are named accordingly and differently. Like in 3D Code, there are brushes that I would recommend painting with. Most of the time, you'll be using the hard round pressure opacity and flow, and a little bit of the soft round pressure opacity and flow. It's really great for hand painting. Now some artists will try to tell you that you need some fancy brushes to become a great artist, but that's not the case. The best artists only use regular brushes and just know how to use them well. It's like in ZBrush. All the great sculpting comes from the Damien standard and clay block in. Don't deny it. Even though the orb crack brushes are pretty great. But that's beside the point. You could be given all these cool brushes to help with painting, but you actually get lost on how to use them correctly and tend to feel fake. I only use special brushes when it comes to compositing, like if I need a layer of fog or cool energy. Now, the amazing part about painting in Photoshop is the control that you have with these brushes. I tend to have more of a painterly feeling in this program because of Photoshop's superior pen pressure system and brush transfer sensitivity. Bouncing back and forth, I set the foundations and landmarks in 3D Code, and then paint final touches and alterations in Photoshop. And in Photoshop, I can paint in areas on a 3D model that I couldn't usually breach in the viewport, like in the areas underneath the fuller or near the epicenter of the blade itself. I also painted some edges because it's easier to have clean edges when painting in Photoshop as opposed to 3D Code. Now you saw me jump back into 3D Code. If you hit Ctrl S, then it will switch to 3D Code and it will update the model based on what you painted. I would be careful at this point when it comes to 3D Code to Photoshop workflow. If you decide to spend a considerable amount of time into 3D Code and so happen to switch to Photoshop without bridging, doing a minor touch and then bridging back into 3D Code, all the layers will be replaced with the old Photoshop layers. That's why it's important to constantly bridge when you're switching back and forth so that you don't lose precious time at work. You'll also notice that the wireframe layer transitioned into 3D Code because it was a duplicate and it came out of hiding. It is annoying, I'll admit. And you'd ask, why not just remove it if it's a nuisance? The reason why is because it's also helpful. Notice that when it's enabled, UV layout now has a wireframe layout where you can paint on it if you decide to do some quick touch-ups without the need to use the bridge to Photoshop. All you need to do is enable and disable the layer accordingly. And at this point, I'm just further painting in my values and the edges that are needed. The edges play an important role when selling hand-painted work. Since there's an apparent light source on one side of the frame, the edges closest to the source are highlighted brighter than the ones at the opposite end. And the edges are still there. You can see that they are still painted in there. I wanted to point something out in relation to gradiency. How I kept mentioning not to lose the foundation of gradiency. And it's still in there. Even if it's subtle or not, it has to remain apparent. One of my instructors at Noman, Damon Woods, is the director of character art at Servius, who taught the character for games class. He's a pretty awesome guy, and that's taught me a lot of the character pipeline. One of the things he pointed out in textures, for both realistic and stylized, was that there was never any semblance of a flat color in a texture. Sure, stylized characters may seem like they have large segments of a singular color, but the subtlety in gradiency shows that there's never any flat coloring in textures. And that's something you should look out for. If you have flat coloring, it needs to change, because it's not selling the piece well. And I have to agree with that. Look at your skin. There are different tones of colors, not just one uniform color. Or even look at leather. It's a semblance of different arrays of the same color, either underneath, the cracks, or on top of the surface. Like painting these textures in, it's a canvas. It's a painting where every inch has a stroke of color or pattern. There are no large blotches of a single color. And there will be exceptions, like deep shades that you won't see like in the shadows underneath, like the blade or behind the fuller. But that's alright. As long as you can sell the piece as believable, then it will tie together. And if you notice, I'm using Ben's advice on putting contrasting values next to each other, and switching back and forth between Photoshop and 3D Code to soften or sharpen features to sell that gold. It just takes time and practice. Now I'll be skipping ahead at certain parts, or speeding up the video a lot, because I already laid down the foundations of the painting process, and it's a lot of the same process. Like I said, it takes time. Painting foundations and landmarks in 3D Code, finishing the paint in Photoshop and adding alterations, bridging back into 3D Code for the same cycle. If you were to listen to my 12-hour session, I was mostly rambling about edges anyways and that they needed to be more apparent, which is true. I'll mostly share my thoughts in these last few parts and just point out certain things to look out for when painting. Like on this blade, and especially on this blade. The edges are strong and apparent. Steel has very strong components and highlights. What really sells it is on the sheen. And you should really be looking at the highlights and the edges of the blade. A lot of references make it apparent. And similar to gold, since it's metal, there are contrasts to certain values. Not as strong as gold, but still apparent. When pitting metal, it's not just values of light to dark. Sometimes it's light, medium, dark, light dark, medium dark, etc. It's very dependent on how you want the metal to look like. I want to say around 80% of the blade should be filled with edges. It is very apparent, and those edges should show some resemblance to damage, dents, and scratches. But you also don't want to overpower the image of the sword with too many dents and scratches. There is a balance, and you don't want to lose the semblance of stylistic appeal. One thing that I forgot to mention was in Photoshop. I use the polygonal lasso tool a lot with the sharp scratches and forms, which helps a lot since those forms shouldn't be soft. They need to be battle-worn hard and fast sharpness, so that it only has selections that I can form with the tool. Crystals are one of my favorite challenges when it comes to hand painting. Now, since we're hand painting them, we're losing the ability to make them translucent with certain maps in the PBR workflow, which a lot of the gems are. And there are actual workaways around them, and gradiency helps out a lot in this case. So if we can't make it, we'll have to fake it. But carefully though. We'll have to build it in layers. You want to start from darker colors to light. From bottom to top, or in this case, inside to out. And you want to highlight those edges. And then you want some layering up with some variations. In this case, it's blues and greens to colors to make it look like there's some deeper layers inside. Finally, I think there are some layers on some bright blues in the center of the gemstone diamonds to resemble some glowing on the inside and fading gradually to the edges. At that point, you really want to use the soft edges to give off the feeling of soft scratches that diamonds have, but enough to be pristine still, or the different variations of color it has. Because if you look at the reference, it's kind of a mismatch of colors, but in some strange semblance, they all work out really well. And that's the trouble of doing this with just hand painting. But if you sell your colors right, you can really do it well. It's kind of like what Ben said. You kind of have to mess around with the contrast of the highs and low values. But with diamonds, they have to be really similar, but also slightly different at the same time. But when you nail the look for hand-painted stylized gems and diamonds for this workflow, then you pretty much have it down. It's one of the more difficult parts to nail. Like diamonds, fabrics are a different kind of challenge. Usually, you'd have a program like Marvelous Designer to simulate some fabrics, and then add the finer details in ZBrush to get that distinct fabric feel. But in this way, we'd have to really fake it. Unlike diamonds, however, there's no trick around it. You have to really pay attention to your references. Watch how the light scatters on the material, like how it dissipates on leather compared to something more of a rough cloth, like on the grip of the sword. There is no shortcut for this one. You'll need a good eye on this and a lot of time. Edges are more subtle, and the values are different because of how certain cloth absorbs light. However, this one is easier to have real-life references to. Just take a look around you, grab a shirt or jacket, and study how light bounces off or how it feels. Just don't forget the contrast and gradiency, because it's still apparent. When you feel like you've come to a point where you're satisfied with your painting, now comes the part where you can export these assets into a render like Marmoset or back into Maya. All you have to do is to go to Textures, Export, Color Albedo Map. I'll show you the rest in the Marmoset viewer. This next part is pretty simple. Import your model, in this case it's the Champion's Pride sword. I would recommend unchecking the callback faces for each of the meshes in the group so that you can't see through that part of the sword. It will cause some awkward renders at certain angles if you leave that alone. Next, go to the material and turn off everything except for albedo and diffusion. Under diffusion, change it from Lambertian to unlit. Change the albedo color to white and import your texture. Since lighting is intentional in the painting, we won't be relying on any lights and just leave it as it is, as a flat unlit model. The painting will sell itself. At this point, you can select the FBX in the outliner and go to Scene, Add Object, Turntable. Press play and you have a nice turntable for your weapon. I want to thank everyone who watched this video, for Thomas for reaching out, everyone on Stylized Station for this awesome opportunity, and my fellow peers and instructors at school and the community. I hope you learned something from this video, or at least enjoyed me rambling on for however long this video will be. I don't know. But thank you again, and have a good day.